But at this point in time, it does not make sense for the Russians to agree to a ceasefire. And they're not agreeing to a ceasefire. They're agreeing to it only in principle.
So recently, John Mearsheimer, one of the greatest minds in foreign policy as far as I see it, went on Judge Napolitano's podcast and talked about this new ceasefire arrangement between Ukraine and Russia, which Russia said they agree with in principle, but not in terms of the tangibles, and more discussions are needed. I think that this is a really interesting discussion because he lays out some of the reasons why the ceasefire might actually be a roadblock to peace in that region rather than kind of a step along the way. So let's listen and react and get his input.
So in 1 week, Secretary of State Marco Rubio presented to the press what he said was a ceasefire agreement to which President Zelensky of Ukraine had signed on. Nothing in writing, just Secretary Rubio's words. In the same week, President Trump resumed the supply of military equipment and ammunition to Kyiv and authorized the return of U.S. intelligence.
Big mistake.
In the same week, Ukraine dispatched about 350 drones to bomb a residential neighborhood in Moscow. What's your take on this week?
Well, it's quite clear that the Americans are trying to play nice with the Ukrainians, but they're not making any meaningful concessions. And they're working with the Ukrainians to see if they can get this whole peace process moving forward. And then today we had this very interesting announcement from Putin about the ceasefire, which is very interesting because he effectively says that he accepts the idea of a ceasefire in principle, but then he notes that there will be some very significant obstacles that basically mean that in practice it will never work, or if it does work, it'll take a long time to implement, and who knows what happens in the meantime. But things are moving very rapidly, but I'm not sure we're any closer to a meaningful settlement of this conflict today than we were 2 weeks ago.
Hard to disagree with that, too. And if I was Putin, my first requirement for any ceasefire would be the stop of the continuance of U.S. aid to Ukraine. Can't really blame him. He has the upper hand. He is occupying all of the Donbass provinces in the east and also Crimea. And there's been virtually no territorial changes. So it's hard for me to believe that under the guise that the U.S. can keep funneling more and more billions, that they'll agree to this. But we'll see, I guess.
I'm going to play for you a clip from the Secretary of State, ask your comments on it, and then I will play for you what President Putin had to say about this. It's interesting, the Putin clip, the network from which we extracted it ran underneath what we call the lower thirds. Putin accepts ceasefire. Of course, one man's acceptance is another man's rejection. They apparently wrote that headline on the basis of the first words out of his mouth, not on the basis of his ticking off the various conditions, which have been consistent throughout and which apparently are not addressed by Secretary Rubio. Here's Secretary Rubio, Professor Mearsheimer, in Ireland yesterday, basically saying, oh, I hope they say yes. Cut number one.
Are you truly prepared to apply pressure on Russia should it be recalcitrant and not agree to the terms of this ceasefire? There's been no concrete action that this administration has taken to punish Russia since it's come to office.
There's a couple points. To be clear, as far as I am aware, the United States has not provided armaments to Russia. The United States is not providing assistance to Russia. Every single sanction that has been imposed on Russia remains in place. Every single sanction the president inherited remains in place.
Previous administration.
Right, but well, I mean, they're pretty sanctioned up. I mean, there's a lot of sanctions on already. My point being is that there's been no steps taken to relieve any of these things. These things continue to be in place, but we don't think it's constructive for me to stand here today and begin to issue threats about what we're going to do if Russia says no. Let's hope they say yes.
Are the presence of the sanctions, which have resulted in an increase in economic activity and prosperity in Russia, which have caused American businesses to lose $330 billion in revenue. Really leverage that Marco Rubio has with Sergei Lavrov and President Putin?
Not really. As you say, the Russians have basically beaten the sanctions. There are all sorts of people who will say that at the end of this year, the sanctions will finally kick in and bring the Russians to their knees. But they've been saying this for the past 2 years.
Yeah, Douglas McGregor said something similar. They have worked around the sanctions regime, and the sanctions mostly particularly hurt middle and lower class people in Russia from getting, food and supplies. It doesn't really hurt the regime as much. Maybe a little bit, but the regime actually uses the sanctions as a propaganda scheme to blame the US and continue the war. It's how they drive a lot of the public support for it. So
it's hard to believe that that's true. The fact is the sanctions have not worked. And it is important to emphasize that Secretary Rubio did not, in this instance, threaten more sanctions. I think what he's interested in doing is seeing if the Americans can work with the Russians to make this ceasefire work and then get the peace process on its way.
Here's President Putin. It's a long statement, but we've edited it down to a little under 2 minutes, commenting on the ceasefire. Now, nothing's been reduced to writing as far as we know. The communications to the Russians, as far as we know, have been public communications, which we've all seen, like this one. And you'll chuckle, I think, at the lower third saying Putin accepts ceasefire, but I'd like your thoughts on it. Chris, cut number 16.
So how are they going to use these 30 days? Are they going to use it in order to continue the forced mobilization in Ukraine, in order to supply weapons to those areas, in order to newly mobilized units to undergo training, or none of this is going to happen? Then we have a question. How are we going to resolve the issues of control or verification? How can we be guaranteed that none of this is going to happen in the future? How are we going to control this? I think on the level of common sense, everyone understands this. This is a very serious question. Who is going to give orders to ceasefire? And what is the value of these orders? Can you imagine about 2,000 kilometers? Who is going to determine who and where violated this agreement? That's an area of 2,000 kilometers. And then who is going to blame who? The violations of this agreement. All of these are questions that need to be thoroughly studied on both sides. So the idea in itself is correct and we support it, but there are questions that need to be discussed. I think we need to discuss this with our American partners. Maybe we need to have a call with President Trump and discuss this. But the idea in itself to stop this conflict in a peaceful way, that's something that we support.
Start with Secretary of State Rubio. Is the United States a true neutral mediator here? Because in my view, and I suspect in yours, the U.S. is a co-belligerent, which started, promoted, provoked, and financed the war against Russia.
The primary belligerent that has used Ukraine as a pawn on a chessboard since the 90s, since it overthrew the Yanukovych government, inserted its own, put missiles that are dual purpose along Ukraine-Russia's border, etc. There were so many ways in which the U.S. acted as the belligerent.
Yeah, there's no question. The United States and Ukraine, or more generally, the West and Ukraine, are at war against Russia. The idea that we're a third party or a mediator is not a serious argument.
And it's clear that President Putin is not interested in giving the Ukrainians 30 days in which to regroup. One would think Secretary Rubio, an inexperienced diplomat, but a person familiar with American foreign policy and the intelligence community from his years in the Senate on the Senate Intel Committee, would know that.
I think that Secretary Rubio knows what's going on here. He's not a fool. And I don't think that President Trump is fooled by what's going on here. Look, the fact is that Putin is in the driver's seat because the Ukrainians are losing on the battlefield and we have no way of rescuing the situation. So it's in Putin's interest to present an image of a reasonable statesman who talks in very judicious terms and wants to do everything he can to facilitate peace and go along with some sort of ceasefire if we work out the terms, while at the same time playing hardball. He'd be a fool not to play hardball, but he wants to have the velvet glove over the mailed fist. And this is exactly what's going on. So
but the U.S. has no veiled fist, does it? The U.S. has no leverage with Russia.
No, my point is he has the mailed fist and he's putting the velvet glove over the mailed fist. This is what you see when you listen to Putin talk. He goes out of his way to sound reasonable, and he'd be foolish.
Okay, I misunderstood you. I thought you said Senator Rubio has the velvet glove over the mailed fist.
No.
You're saying President Putin does. Fully understood and totally accepted. But Rubio has no cards to play.
That's correct. We have no cards to play. We lost the war.
And I think Mearsheimer's point here is good because the last thing that Putin would have wanted to do, and I mean, Putin's played this pretty shrewdly, is just outright reject the ceasefire without any other further commentary, because the last thing he wants is for the pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine, endless aid brigade to be able to blame him for continuing, the war and just being able to sell additional aid for Ukraine despite how much of a failure the policy has been after $200 billion, hundreds of thousands of dead lives, and virtually no territorial changes.
Remember, as you said, we are a co-belligerent in this war, and we lost the war, or we are losing the war. All you have to do is look at what's happening in Kursk. We are in trouble.
When I was with Foreign Minister Lavrov on Monday, off the record, afterwards, in small talk with him, I said, "What are the chances of you people agreeing to a ceasefire?" And he said, "Why would we do that?" And he's right. They're close to a triumph, at least in terms of the territory that they seek, are they not?
Yes, but the smart thing for them to do, and this is what they're doing, is saying they accept the idea of a ceasefire in principle. And then they're telling us, this is what Putin was doing, what all the obstacles are to actually putting that ceasefire into effect. And
yeah, this is a propaganda play, and that's not to have a negative or positive judgment. It's a smart play, but it is a propaganda play. They don't want to be seen as the bad guy, the sheer roadblock to peace.
It becomes clear after listening to him talk, and he wasn't even raising all the obstacles that are out there, that you're not going to get a meaningful ceasefire unless the Russians are doing so well in terms of executing the war that a ceasefire makes sense for them. That may be the case somewhere down the road, but at this point in time, it does not make sense for the Russians to agree to a ceasefire, and they're not agreeing to a ceasefire. They're agreeing to it only in principle.
If we agree that President Putin's conditions are total neutrality, no NATO, no military, territorial integrity for the Russian speaking peoples, Ukraine is never going to agree to this voluntarily, are they?
It's hard to imagine. It really is. I mean, you may get the Europeans to go along. That'll be tough. But getting the Ukrainians to accept the permanent loss of a significant slice of their territory and agreeing to demilitarize and exist without security guarantees.
Wow.
it's hard
Well,
to.
I forgot one more condition that he is insisting upon: elections, because in their view, I realize that Ukraine is the interpreter of its own constitution, not Russia. But in the Russian view, President Zelensky is illegitimate and either needs to be reelected or replaced by someone who is elected.
I understand that argument, but I don't think in the end it makes any difference, because it's not like you're going to get someone in office, someone to replace Zelensky who's interested in accepting Russia's terms.
Agreed. I mean, unless that person is a puppet installed by the U.S., and if that's the case, they'll be enormously unpopular in Ukraine and maybe not even long-lived.
Yeah, I think that's sadly basically true.
So it's hard to deny what Napolitano and and John Mearsheimer are talking about here. Zelensky has maybe put his life under risk for taking the road that he has, and maybe even negotiating a ceasefire. But it's a pretty tough pill to swallow if Ukrainians have to give up all the eastern provinces in the Donbass, as well as Crimea. They pretty much really have no choice at this point. I mean, like these guys talked about, Russia is essentially in the driver's seat. They're close to victory, at least under the terms it seems like they want, and it is the culturally Russian parts of Ukraine, and to maintain Crimea like they've had for a decade in Crimea. So I don't know. This ceasefire, I don't see it really producing a peaceful outcome, because it seems like Russia is essentially maintaining the status quo, but just trying to say, like, we accept in principle, just as kind of a propaganda victory. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you guys think this ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia will work out and actually result in a peace? Or will it take significant pressure from the U.S. on Ukraine to accept a peace? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear from you guys. Like the video, please subscribe to the channel. And until next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.